March 15, 1945. The morning air in Camp Bradford, Texas carried an unexpected sweetness that drifted through the barbed wire fences and into the women's barracks long before breakfast call. Friederike Lang woke to the scent first, her eyes opening in the pre-dawn darkness as her mind struggled to place the familiar aroma that seemed impossibly out of place in this prisoner of war compound. It smelled like home. More specifically, it smelled like Sunday morning in her mother's kitchen in Bremen, back when Sunday still meant something beyond survival and duty. She sat up on her narrow cot, careful not to wake Hedwig Baumann in the bunk beside her. The scent grew stronger as other women began to stir, their movements accompanied by confused whispers in German. Buttermilk biscuits. Someone was baking buttermilk biscuits, but that made no sense. It was Wednesday, not Sunday, and they were prisoners in America, not daughters gathering around family tables in Germany. Friederike had been at Camp Bradford for 4 months now, long enough to know the routine of American military meals. Breakfast meant oatmeal or occasionally scrambled eggs from powder, served with bitter coffee and plain bread. Nothing ever smelled like this. By the time the wake-up bell rang, every woman in the barracks was already dressed and standing at attention beside their bunks, their confusion evident in sidelong glances and raised eyebrows. Thekla Schmidt, at 34, the oldest among them, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. In German, she muttered, "Have the Americans made a mistake? Do they think today is Sunday?" The question rippled through the ranks as they filed out toward the mess hall, their boots crunching on the gravel path in synchronized formation. Despite months of captivity, they maintained the military discipline that had been drilled into them as members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps. The mess hall doors opened, and the scent hit them with full force. There, on each of the long wooden tables, sat plates piled high with golden brown buttermilk biscuits, steam still rising from their flaky surfaces. Beside them sat small dishes of real butter, not the margarine they had grown accustomed to, and jars of what appeared to be honey and jam. Friederike felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She had not seen such abundance since before the war, and certainly never expected to see it as a prisoner of the enemy. Corporal Vincent Martinez stood near the serving line, a short man with dark hair and an apron dusted with flour. He was watching the women's reactions with an expression that Friederike could not quite read. Not mockery, not pity, but something else entirely. Private Roy Henderson, the tall Nebraska farm boy who served as one of their guards, was helping to distribute the plates with unusual care, making sure each woman received an equal portion. Captain Eleanor Sinclair entered through the side door, her presence commanding immediate attention. The German women snapped to attention, still uncertain whether this unexpected feast was some kind of test or trick. The captain's voice was firm, but not unkind, as she addressed them in English. "At ease, ladies. Sit and eat while the food is hot." Friederike translated quickly for those whose English remained weak, though her own voice wavered slightly on the words. They sat in cautious silence, none daring to reach for the biscuits first. Rosemary Hartman, the youngest at 20, stared at her plate with tears forming in her eyes. "My grandmother made these every Sunday," she whispered in German. "Every single Sunday before church." Around the room, heads nodded in recognition. This was not American food. This was memory made tangible, comfort transformed into something they could touch and taste. Mechthild Werner, whom everyone called Tilda, finally reached for a biscuit with trembling hands. She broke it open, watching the steam escape, and spread butter across its surface with the reverence usually reserved for religious ritual. When she took her first bite, a single tear rolled down her cheek. The floodgates opened then. All around the mess hall, German women who had maintained stoic composure through capture, transport, and months of imprisonment were undone by buttermilk biscuits on a Wednesday morning. November 12, 1944. The transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Bradford, carrying their cargo of defeated enemies. Friederike Lang pressed her face against the canvas covering, catching glimpses of flat Texas landscape so different from the rolling hills of Bremen. She clutched a small leather satchel containing everything she had been allowed to keep: a photograph of her family, a comb, and a diary her sister had given her before she left for auxiliary service 2 years earlier. The trucks lurched to a stop, and American voices barked orders in English. Friederike understood enough to know they were being told to disembark in orderly fashion. She climbed down first, her legs stiff from the 3-day journey from the processing center in New York. Behind her came 59 other women, all wearing the remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing insignia that marked their former roles as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel. They had been captured in France during the chaotic German retreat, rounded up as Allied forces swept through positions that had been considered safe rear areas just weeks before. None of them had expected to end up as prisoners of war. Women were not supposed to be combatants, yet here they stood, in an American detention facility, enemy nationals on foreign soil. Captain Eleanor Sinclair stood waiting, flanked by armed guards. She was younger than Friederike expected, perhaps 35, with sharp eyes that seemed to assess each prisoner individually. When she spoke, her voice carried across the assembled group with military precision. "You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. Follow orders, maintain discipline, and you will be safe here." Friederike translated in whispers for those around her, though the captain's tone conveyed enough meaning. Safe. The word felt strange in this context. They were prisoners, enemies of the state that now held them. Safety seemed like a concept from another lifetime. The barracks were crude but weatherproof, long wooden structures with rows of metal bunks and thin mattresses. Each woman was issued 2 blankets, a pillow, and basic toiletries. The Americans were efficient, processing them with bureaucratic thoroughness that felt almost impersonal. Names were recorded, photographs taken, personal items cataloged. Friederike watched as Hedwig Baumann, ahead of her, surrendered a small silver locket, receiving a numbered receipt in return. That first night, the women lay in their bunks listening to unfamiliar sounds. The Texas wind rattled the barracks walls differently than European winds. Somewhere in the distance, American soldiers sang songs in English, their voices carrying across the compound. Rosemary Hartman sobbed quietly in her bunk, trying to muffle the sound in her pillow. Thekla Schmidt's voice cut through the darkness in German. "We are alive. Whatever happens next, we are alive. That is more than many can say tonight." The words offered little comfort, but they were true. They had survived capture, survived transport across an ocean, survived the uncertainty of not knowing whether they would be shot or imprisoned. Now they faced a different kind of survival, enduring captivity in a land that was supposed to be filled with enemies who would treat them with the cruelty they had been taught to expect. The first 2 weeks at Camp Bradford established a pattern of cautious coexistence. The German women moved through their days with mechanical precision, following the routines established by Captain Sinclair. Morning roll call at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work assignments from 8 until noon, lunch, more work until 4, dinner at 5, and lights out at 9. The schedule was rigid but not cruel, designed more to maintain order than to punish. Friederike found herself assigned to the camp administrative office, where her English skills made her useful for filing and basic clerical work. Hedwig worked in the laundry. Thekla, with her medical background, was placed under the supervision of Lieutenant Grace Sullivan in the small camp infirmary. The Americans seemed to recognize their skills and use them practically, another surprise that contradicted the propaganda they had been fed about American wastefulness and disorganization. But the nights were difficult. Late November brought unexpected cold to the Texas plains, and the thin blankets issued to prisoners provided inadequate warmth. The barracks had a small stove at each end, but fuel was rationed carefully. Women huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and body heat, their breath visible in the frigid air. Private Roy Henderson noticed Rosemary Hartman shivering during evening roll call. She was the youngest, barely 20, with blonde hair she kept in 2 neat braids that made her look even younger. She had been a typist in a Wehrmacht supply office in Belgium, far from any combat, yet here she was, trembling in the Texas cold, her lips turning blue despite her attempts to maintain composure. Henderson was 23, a farm boy from a small town outside Lincoln, Nebraska. He had 3 younger sisters back home, and something about Rosemary's obvious distress triggered his protective instincts. After roll call, he approached Sergeant Walter Novak with a request. "That youngest German girl, sir, she's not handling the cold well. Could we spare an extra blanket?" Novak, whose own family had fled Czechoslovakia when he was a child, understood what it meant to be cold and far from home. He nodded slowly. "1 blanket. But you deliver it, Henderson. Let her know it comes from you personally, not from official channels. Sometimes kindness means more when it has a face." That evening, Henderson approached the women's barracks with a folded wool blanket under his arm. He knocked on the doorframe, waiting for permission to enter. Thekla answered, her expression immediately suspicious. Henderson held up the blanket, gesturing toward Rosemary, who sat on her bunk in the background. "For her, bid," he said simply in his limited German. "Cold, extra blanket." The women stared at him in confusion. Enemy soldiers did not bring comfort to prisoners. This violated everything they understood about captivity. Rosemary stood slowly, approaching with obvious uncertainty. Henderson held out the blanket, his expression earnest and awkward. When she took it, her fingers brushed his, and she felt the warmth of the wool that had clearly come from American military supplies. "Danke," she whispered, the German word for thank you barely audible. Henderson nodded, already backing toward the door, uncomfortable with the attention. As he left, Rosemary held the blanket against her chest, feeling its weight and warmth. Around her, the other women gathered close, touching the fabric as if it might reveal some hidden meaning. Corporal Vincent Martinez had not intended to become the catalyst for anything significant. He was simply a cook assigned to Camp Bradford because the Army needed someone who could feed large groups efficiently, and his grandmother had taught him well. She had immigrated from Mexico to Texas when Vincent was 5, bringing with her recipes and traditions that blended cultures in ways that made sense only in borderland kitchens. His grandmother had insisted that Sundays required special food, not fancy food, but food made with care and attention that weekday meals could not receive. Buttermilk biscuits were her specialty, taught to her by a neighbor woman in San Antonio who had come from Tennessee. The recipe traveled across cultures because good food recognized no boundaries. Every Sunday morning, young Vincent would wake to the smell of those biscuits, knowing that the day ahead would be different from the 6 that preceded it. Now, standing in the camp kitchen on a Wednesday morning in March, Vincent found himself thinking about Sundays. He had been watching the German women for months, observing how they moved through their days with such careful control, never complaining, never asking for anything beyond basic necessities. They reminded him of his grandmother in the early years after immigration, maintaining dignity through sheer force of will, while everything familiar had been stripped away. The previous evening, he had received a shipment of fresh buttermilk, an unexpected surplus from a nearby dairy. The camp commander had authorized its use before it spoiled. Most cooks would have made pancakes or used it in general cooking. But Vincent stood in the pre-dawn kitchen, measuring flour and salt, cutting cold butter into the mixture with practiced efficiency, and he thought about Sundays and about women far from home. He had help from 2 other kitchen workers, both privates who followed his directions without question. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared routine. By 5:30 in the morning, the first batch of biscuits emerged from the ovens, golden and perfect. Vincent split one open, checking the texture. and was transported instantly to his grandmother's kitchen. The smell was exact. Private Henderson came in for early coffee and stopped short. "Martinez, what are you making? That smells incredible." Vincent shrugged, already preparing the next batch. "Buttermilk biscuits. We had the ingredients, seemed like the right thing to do." Henderson watched him work for a moment before speaking carefully. "You know they're going to react to this, right? The German women. This isn't regular camp food." Vincent met his eyes steadily. "My grandmother used to say that food is how we tell people they matter. These women, they're still people, Henderson, even if they were on the other side, maybe especially because they were on the other side." The philosophy was simple but profound, rooted in the border wisdom that understood how arbitrary lines could be, how easily circumstances might have been reversed. The buttermilk biscuits created a shift that nobody could quite articulate, but everyone felt. In the days following that Wednesday morning, the German women moved through their routines with a new awareness, watching their American captors with confusion that bordered on suspicion. Kindness from enemies made no sense within the framework they had been given. Propaganda had taught them that Americans were cruel materialists who would show no mercy to defeated Germans. Friederike found herself caught between two worlds as the camp's unofficial translator. Her English had been good before the war, learned from a school teacher who had studied in London, and 4 months of immersion had sharpened her skills considerably. She worked in the administrative office each morning, filing reports and organizing paperwork under the supervision of a clerk named Sergeant Morrison, who treated her with polite professionalism that felt almost absurd given their respective positions. During lunch on the third day after the biscuits, Private Henderson approached the table where Friederike sat with Hedwig and Tilda. He carried his own tray and gestured toward the empty seat across from them. "May I?" he asked in careful German, the words clearly rehearsed. The three women exchanged glances before Friederike nodded slowly. Henderson sat, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. "I wanted to ask," he began in English, then paused, searching for simpler words. "Where are you from? In Germany?" Friederike translated for the others before answering. "Bremen. I am from Bremen. Hedwig is from Munich. Tilda from a small town near Frankfurt." Henderson nodded, pulling a worn photograph from his pocket. It showed a farmhouse surrounded by flat land stretching to the horizon. "Nebraska, my home, very flat, like Texas." The conversation was halting and awkward, conducted in a mixture of English and basic German, with Friederike bridging the gaps. But something emerged from that awkwardness that surprised everyone involved. Henderson talked about his three sisters, about winter wheat and summer corn, about missing home. The German women found themselves sharing similar stories about siblings and seasons, about the ordinary details of life before war transformed everything. What struck Friederike most forcefully was the realization that Henderson was homesick. Just as homesick as they were, perhaps more so, because he could not understand why he had to be here guarding women who posed no threat when he could be home helping with spring planting. The Americans had not wanted this war any more than many Germans had. They were simply caught in the same vast machinery of conflict that ground individuals into interchangeable pieces. Over the following weeks, similar conversations began occurring throughout the camp. Sergeant Novak taught German phrases to guards during their breaks, learning German words in return. The exchanges were simple, practical, focused on everyday objects and basic courtesy. But language created connections that transcended national boundaries. When Rosemarie taught Henderson how to properly pronounce Guten Morgen, and he taught her to say good morning without her heavy accent, they were building something that propaganda could not easily destroy. Thekla, working in the infirmary, found herself discussing medical techniques with Lieutenant Sullivan. Despite the language barrier, they developed a professional rapport based on shared knowledge and mutual respect for proper procedure. Sullivan treated Thekla as a colleague rather than a prisoner, asking her opinion on treatment plans and listening carefully to her responses. The confusion deepened daily. These Americans were supposed to be enemies, yet they acted like people. They were supposed to be cruel, yet they showed unexpected kindnesses. The contradiction forced the German women to confront uncomfortable questions about everything they had been taught. December arrived with unseasonable warmth, followed by sudden cold snaps that reminded everyone winter recognized no borders. Captain Sinclair faced an unexpected dilemma as Christmas approached. The German women showed signs of deepening depression, their carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of being far from home during a season heavy with tradition and memory. Medical reports from Lieutenant Sullivan noted increased cases of insomnia and loss of appetite among the prisoners. Sinclair called a meeting with her senior staff to discuss options. "These women are going to be with us for months, possibly longer," she told the assembled guards and officers. "We can maintain minimum standards and watch them deteriorate, or we can recognize that basic humanity serves our interests as well as theirs. A camp full of severely depressed prisoners creates problems for everyone." Sergeant Novak spoke carefully. "Captain, my family celebrated Christmas, even in the displaced persons camp after we fled Czechoslovakia. The aid workers understood that letting us maintain some traditions helped us survive emotionally. I think the same principle applies here." The decision was made to allow a modest Christmas celebration with strict parameters. No propaganda materials, no political content, but simple decorations made from available materials and permission to observe their religious traditions. When Friederike translated the announcement, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Women who had maintained stoic reserve for weeks openly wept with relief and gratitude. They threw themselves into preparations with energy that had been dormant for months. Paper chains appeared, created from colored paper, salvaged from administrative offices. Simple ornaments took shape from wire and fabric scraps. The women sang while they worked, German Christmas carols that drifted through the barracks with bittersweet beauty. Hedwig approached Friederike 3 days before Christmas with a proposal that made both of them nervous. "We should offer to sing for the Americans," she said quietly. "Not just German songs, but American ones too, to show gratitude for this kindness." Friederike understood the risk. Such a gesture could be seen as weakness, as betrayal of their country. But it could also be seen as simple human courtesy, acknowledgement that their captors had chosen mercy over indifference. She brought the proposal to Captain Sinclair, her carefully prepared English speech, feeling inadequate for the complexity of what they wanted to express. Sinclair listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Friederike finished, the captain was silent for a long moment before responding. That would be acceptable. Christmas Eve, after dinner, in the main hall, but only if every woman participates voluntarily. No pressure, no obligation. Christmas Eve arrived with clear, cold skies and a temperature that dropped rapidly after sunset. The mess hall had been transformed with the simple decorations, and someone had procured a small pine tree that stood in the corner, unadorned but symbolically powerful. 60 German women stood facing their American captors, their voices joining in "O Tannenbaum," with the natural precision that came from shared cultural memory. The harmonies were achingly beautiful, filling the space with longing for homes that felt impossibly distant. Then came the moment that would be remembered by everyone present. The women attempted Silent Night in English. Their pronunciation was imperfect, their accents heavy, but their sincerity was unmistakable. Private Henderson later wrote to his mother that he had never heard anything more moving than those German voices struggling to honor American traditions in a language that was still foreign to many of them. January 1945 brought a new kind of suffering that no amount of kindness from American captors could ease. The International Red Cross had established procedures for prisoner correspondence, allowing each woman to send brief messages to family members in Germany and to receive replies through neutral channels. The German women had written their letters in November, carefully composing words that would pass censorship while still conveying love and longing for home. By late January, most letters remained unanswered. Friederike checked the mail distribution daily, her hope fading incrementally with each passing week. She had written to her parents in Bremen, to her younger sister Katrin, to her grandmother, who lived in the countryside outside the city. The silence was devastating in ways that captivity itself was not. Not knowing became a special kind of torture. Hedwig had received one letter, a brief note from an aunt in rural Bavaria, confirming that she was alive, but providing no information about Hedwig's parents or brothers. The message was dated October, written before Hedwig's capture. It answered nothing about their current status or whether they even knew she was in American custody. Tilda received nothing. Neither did Rosemarie, whose entire family had lived in Hamburg. The American staff watched helplessly as the women struggled with growing despair. Captain Sinclair contacted Red Cross officials seeking explanations and received responses that offered little comfort. Mail service in Germany had collapsed as Allied bombing intensified. Entire cities were in chaos, populations scattered. Many letters were simply lost in a postal system that no longer functioned reliably. Others may have reached addresses where no one remained to receive them. Thekla, ever pragmatic, tried to organize the women's response to this uncertainty. "We cannot control what is happening in Germany," she told them during an evening gathering in the barracks. "We can only control how we face each day here. Falling into despair serves no purpose except to make ourselves suffer more." Her words were logical but cold comfort against the gnawing fear that everyone they loved might be dead. Friederike began writing in her diary more frequently, composing letters to her family that she knew might never be sent. The act of writing provided an outlet for emotions that had no other acceptable expression. She wrote about the Buttermilk Biscuits, about Christmas, about the strange experience of being treated with unexpected humanity by people who were supposed to be enemies. She wrote questions she could not answer. "Where are you? Are you safe? Do you know where I am?" Private Henderson noticed Friederike's growing withdrawal and mentioned it to Sergeant Novak. "She's not eating much, spends every free moment alone with that diary. I think the waiting is worse for her than the capture was." Novak nodded slowly, remembering his own family's experience of displacement. When you don't know, your imagination fills the void with worst possibilities. There is no comfort anyone can offer except patience and presence. The situation affected everyone differently. Rosemarie became almost manic in her need for activity, volunteering for every extra work assignment, keeping herself exhausted so she could sleep without dreaming. Hedwig grew quieter, more withdrawn. Tilda threw herself into learning English with obsessive focus, as if mastering the language might somehow create connection to replace what had been lost. Lieutenant Grace Sullivan had not expected to form any meaningful connection with the German prisoners under her supervision. She was a career military nurse, trained to maintain professional distance and focus on medical outcomes rather than personal feelings. When Thekla Schmidt was assigned to work in the infirmary, Sullivan viewed it as a practical arrangement, nothing more. The camp needed medical assistance, and Thekla had verifiable training from her service with the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. The first weeks were awkward and formal. Sullivan issued instructions in careful English, and Thekla followed them with precise efficiency, her face a mask of professional neutrality. They worked side by side in near silence, communicating only when necessary for patient care. But medicine created its own language, one that transcended national boundaries. A properly cleaned wound, a correctly administered injection, a patient made comfortable through skilled care, these outcomes spoke louder than any words. The breakthrough came during an emergency in late January. Private Martinez collapsed in the kitchen with symptoms suggesting acute appendicitis. Sullivan immediately began preparing for emergency transport to the nearest military hospital, 40 miles away. But Thekla, observing the patient's presentation, spoke up in halting English. "Lieutenant, I think not appendix. Similar case I saw in Belgium. Kidney stone passing, very painful but not emergency surgery. Sullivan paused, considering. Thekla's assessment contradicted her initial diagnosis, but the German woman's reasoning was sound. They observed Martinez together for 30 minutes, during which his symptoms evolved exactly as Thekla had predicted. When he finally passed the stone, Sullivan acknowledged what had just occurred. "You were right. Your diagnosis was correct. Mine was wrong. Thank you for speaking up." The moment shifted their dynamic fundamentally. Thekla had demonstrated medical competence that commanded respect, and Sullivan had shown willingness to accept correction from someone officially classified as an enemy prisoner. From that point forward, they worked as colleagues rather than captor and captive. Sullivan began asking Thekla's opinion on treatment plans, listening carefully to her observations about patients. Thekla, in turn, began sharing techniques she had learned in German medical training, comparing approaches with genuine professional curiosity. Their conversations expanded beyond immediate medical concerns. Sullivan asked about Thekla's training, her experiences in Belgium, her decision to join the auxiliary corps. Thekla answered honestly, explaining that she had believed she was serving her country's defense, helping wounded soldiers who needed care regardless of politics. Sullivan shared her own journey into military nursing, the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field. One afternoon, while organizing medical supplies, Sullivan spoke carefully. "You're good at this work, Thekla, really good. Have you thought about continuing medical training after the war?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications neither woman wanted to fully examine. After the war meant repatriation, meant returning to a Germany that might not exist in any recognizable form. Thekla's response was quiet but honest. "I do not know what after the war means anymore, Lieutenant. I know only today, and today I am grateful to be doing work that helps people." February 1945 brought news that shattered what remained of the German women's understanding of their own country. American newspapers began publishing detailed reports from the Eastern Front as Soviet forces advanced deeper into German territory. The accounts described discoveries that seemed too horrific to be real: concentration camps filled with skeletal prisoners, evidence of systematic mass murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Captain Sinclair made the decision to allow the German prisoners access to these newspapers. Some of her staff questioned the wisdom of this choice, worried about how the women might react to such devastating information. But Sinclair believed they had a right to know what had been done in their country's name, even if that knowledge brought profound anguish. The camp library became a place of devastating revelation. Friederike sat at one of the wooden tables, reading with growing horror about places she had never heard of. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, names that would become synonymous with evil, but which meant nothing to her until that moment. The newspaper photographs were grainy but clear enough, piles of emaciated bodies, survivors who looked more like ghosts than human beings, American and British soldiers standing amid evidence of atrocities that challenged belief. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. This could not be Germany. This could not be the country she had proudly served. Yet the evidence was irrefutable, documented by multiple sources, photographed by journalists from neutral countries. Hedwig found her there, tears streaming silently down her face. "Friederike," she whispered in German, "tell me this is propaganda. Tell me the Americans are lying to break our spirits." But Friederike could not tell her that. The reports were too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources. More women gathered around the newspapers, reading in shocked silence. Tilda's face had gone completely white. Rosemary looked physically ill. They passed the papers between them with shaking hands, each hoping the next page might somehow contradict what they had already read, might offer some explanation that made sense of the incomprehensible. Thekla spoke what they were all thinking. "We served this. We wore the uniform. We believed we were defending something honorable." The words hung in the air like an accusation. None of them had worked in concentration camps or known about systematic murder. They had been radio operators, clerks, nurses in field hospitals, but they had been part of the machinery that made such horrors possible. That night, the barracks were filled with whispered conversations in German, women trying to reconcile who they thought they were with what their country had done. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the possibility that reports were exaggerated or fabricated. Others, like Friederike, felt the full weight of complicity pressing down on them. She wrote in her diary with a hand that could barely hold the pen. "What kind of Germany will we return to? What kind of Germany were we serving? I thought I knew who I was. Now I understand nothing." Private Henderson, walking past the barracks that night, heard the sound of women weeping and felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. They needed to know. They needed to confront what had been done. But witnessing their anguish still felt cruel, even if necessary. Friederike's diary became her confessor in the weeks following the revelations about German atrocities. She filled page after page with questions that had no answers, trying to trace the path that had led her from a schoolgirl in Bremen to a prisoner of war, grappling with the knowledge that everything she believed had been built on lies. The writing was her attempt to find solid ground in a world where all foundations had crumbled. She wrote about her childhood, about growing up in the 1930s as Germany rebuilt itself from the humiliation of the previous war. She remembered feeling proud as the country regained strength and purpose. She remembered her father, a postal clerk, speaking about restored German dignity. She remembered her teachers emphasizing duty and service to the fatherland. None of them had seemed like monsters. They had seemed like ordinary people trying to build something better. When had it gone wrong? She wrote the question over and over, trying to identify the moment when patriotic pride had transformed into something darker. But there had been no single moment, no clear line that separated before from after. It had been gradual, incremental, each small compromise leading to the next until somehow the unthinkable had become reality. She wrote, "We told ourselves we were defending our homeland. We told ourselves the restrictions were temporary, necessary for security. We told ourselves that the government knew things we did not. We told ourselves so many lies that we forgot what truth looked like." The other women knew she was writing, but respected her privacy, except for Hedwig, who approached one evening as Friederike sat on her bunk with the diary open. "May I read it?" she asked quietly. Friederike hesitated before nodding. If anyone would understand, it would be Hedwig, who had gone through the same journey from certainty to devastating doubt. Hedwig read in silence, her expression shifting from recognition to pain to something like relief. When she finished, she looked at Friederike with tears in her eyes. "You've written what I feel but could not say. We were not evil people. We were foolish people. Is that better or worse?" The question had no good answer. Evil could be fought and defeated. Foolishness was harder to confront because it implicated everyone who had believed, everyone who had looked away, everyone who had chosen comfort over questioning. They talked late into the night, voices low so they would not disturb others. They discussed the propaganda they had absorbed, the way information had been controlled, the pressure to conform that made dissent nearly impossible. But they also acknowledged their own responsibility. They had chosen not to ask difficult questions. They had accepted easy answers because challenging them would have required courage they had not possessed. Tilda joined the conversation, then Rosemarie, then others. The barracks became a place of painful honesty as women examined their own complicity in a system that had produced such horror. Not one of them had killed anyone. Not one had worked in a concentration camp, but they had all participated in the machinery that made such places possible. Sergeant Walter Novak had been watching the German women's anguish with understanding that came from personal experience. His own family had fled Czechoslovakia in 1938, escaping just ahead of German occupation. He had been 12 years old enough to remember the fear and confusion of leaving everything familiar behind. His parents had spoken bitterly about Germans for years, their anger understandable but ultimately exhausting in its intensity. Yet here he was, a decade later, responsible for guarding German women who seemed nothing like the threatening force his parents had described. These were not the architects of invasion, but its foot soldiers, many of them too young to have participated in the decisions that led to war. Watching them grapple with revelations about their country's crimes, Novak saw echoes of his own family's struggle to understand how ordinary people could enable extraordinary evil. One afternoon he found Friederike sitting alone outside the barracks during recreation time. She was staring at nothing, her diary closed beside her. He approached carefully, knowing his presence might not be welcome. "May I sit?" he asked in his careful German. She nodded without looking at him. They sat in silence for several minutes before Novak spoke again, this time in English, knowing she would understand. "My family came from Czechoslovakia. We fled when the Germans came. I hated Germans for a long time because of what happened to us, what happened to my country." Friederike turned to look at him, her expression questioning why he was sharing this. Novak continued, "But my mother, before she died, she told me something important. She said, hating the people does not undo what the government did. It only adds more hate to a world already drowning in it." Friedrich's voice was barely audible. "But we enabled it. We believed the lies. We wore the uniform." Novak nodded slowly. "Yes, and that is something you must carry. But what you do with that knowledge, that is what defines who you become next. My mother forgave individual Germans she met in America, not because they deserved it, but because she deserved peace more than she deserved rage." The conversation opened something in Friederike that had been locked tight since the newspaper revelations. She began to cry, not the silent tears she had shed before, but deep sobs that shook her entire body. Novak sat quietly, offering presence without platitudes. When she finally spoke again, her words came in broken English mixed with German. "I do not know how to forgive myself. I do not know how to live with this." Novak's response was gentle but firm. "You live with it by being different now, by choosing better, by showing others that people can change." He paused before adding, "The Americans here, we could hate you, some of us want to, but we choose to see that you are also victims of the same evil that victimized others. Different kind of victim, yes, but still people who deserve the chance to become better." The words gave Friederike the first glimpse of a path forward, however difficult and uncertain it might be. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with celebrations that echoed across America, but brought only complicated emotions to Camp Bradford. The German women listened to American soldiers cheering, singing, celebrating the defeat of the country these prisoners had once served. The sounds carried through barbed wire like a reminder of everything that had been lost and the uncertain future that now approached. Captain Sinclair called an assembly the following morning. The German women stood in formation as she addressed them in English, with Friederike translating. "The war in Europe has ended. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. In the coming weeks, procedures will begin for repatriation of prisoners of war to their home countries. You will receive more information as arrangements are finalized." The words were factual, official, devoid of triumph or sympathy. After dismissal, the women returned to their barracks in stunned silence. Repatriation meant return to Germany. But what Germany? Reports filtering through newspapers painted a picture of complete devastation. Berlin lay in ruins. Hamburg had been firebombed. Dresden was destroyed. The country had been divided into occupation zones controlled by American, British, French, and Soviet forces. Nothing remained of the Germany they had known. Friederike gathered with Hedwig, Thekla, Tilda, and Rosemarie that evening to discuss what repatriation would mean for each of them. Thekla spoke first, her voice steady but sad. "I have no family left in Germany. My parents died in the bombing of Hamburg. I have nowhere to return to." The admission hung heavy in the air. Rosemarie nodded slowly. "I have heard nothing from my family in 8 months. I must assume they are also gone." Hedwig's situation was marginally better. Her aunt in Bavaria had written once, confirming survival, but reporting that Hedwig's parents' home had been destroyed. They are alive but displaced, living in a church basement with 30 other families. My aunt says there is no work, barely any food, and suspicion toward anyone who served in uniform, even auxiliary services. The picture became clear as they shared information. Returning to Germany meant facing devastation, hunger, homelessness, and likely persecution. They would be seen as failures, women who had been captured by the enemy and possibly corrupted. The shame would follow them in a society struggling to assign blame and make sense of catastrophic defeat. Friederike voiced what others were thinking. What if we could stay here, in America? The words seemed absurd even as she spoke them. They were prisoners of war, enemy nationals. The Geneva Convention required their repatriation, yet the question lingered because daily life in Camp Bradford had evolved into something none of them expected. They had work that gave them purpose. They had been treated with dignity. They had found kindness where they expected only cruelty. Most surprisingly, they had found the possibility of redemption through the Americans' willingness to see them as individuals rather than just enemies. Tilda spoke carefully. We would be asking to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. No one has ever done such a thing. But was it really freedom they would be returning to? Or simply a different, harsher kind of captivity in a country that no longer existed as they had known it? The Henderson family had begun visiting Camp Bradford in March as part of a Lutheran church outreach program. Robert Henderson was a high school principal in the nearby town of Clearwater, and his wife Margaret taught English literature at the same school. They had no children of their own, a source of quiet sadness that had led them to seek purpose through community service when the war brought a prisoner of war camp to their region. Margaret Henderson first encountered Friederike during a supervised visiting session in the camp library. She had been impressed immediately by the young woman's fluent English and obvious intelligence. Their first conversation covered safe topics: books, weather, the landscape differences between Texas and Germany. But Margaret recognized something deeper in Friederike's careful responses, a hunger for intellectual engagement that captivity had suppressed. The visits became regular every Sunday afternoon after church. Margaret brought books that Friederike devoured with desperate gratitude. They discussed literature, philosophy, the questions that education was meant to explore. Robert joined sometimes, sharing his own perspectives. The Hendersons never pretended the war had not happened or that Germany's actions could be excused, but they treated Friederike as a person capable of growth and change, not as a fixed enemy forever defined by her past. After the newspaper revelations about concentration camps, Margaret arrived for a visit to find Friederike devastated and withdrawn. Instead of avoiding the difficult topic, Margaret addressed it directly. What happened in those camps was evil beyond words. But you are not responsible for things you never knew about, Friederike. The question is not what was done in your country's name before you knew. The question is what you choose to do with that knowledge now. The words offered no absolution, but provided framework for moving forward. Friederike broke down, confessing her shame and confusion. Margaret listened without judgment, acknowledging the complexity of guilt and innocence in systems where evil operated through ordinary people following orders. Redemption is possible, Margaret said firmly, but only if you choose it actively, consciously, every day going forward. When news came of Germany's surrender and impending repatriation procedures, Margaret and Robert discussed a possibility that felt both natural and impossible. They approached Captain Sinclair with a proposal. If there were a way for Friederike Lang to remain in America, we would sponsor her, provide housing, help her find employment, support her integration into American society. Sinclair was taken aback. The Langes are enemy nationals, Mrs. Henderson. Sponsoring her would require exceptional circumstances and extensive legal processes. Margaret's response was calm but determined. "Then we will pursue those processes." This young woman has shown genuine remorse, remarkable intelligence, and real potential to contribute positively to American society. Sending her back to nothing seems wasteful of human possibility. The offer planted a seed that would grow into something unprecedented. If one family was willing to sponsor a German prisoner, might others be willing as well? And if sponsorship was possible, did that change the equation around repatriation? The questions would soon become urgent as the women faced their most consequential choice. May 22, 1945. Captain Sinclair called a mandatory assembly to announce official repatriation procedures. The 60 German women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean. Sinclair stood before them holding documents from the War Department, her expression serious but not unkind. She explained the timeline, the processing procedures, the transportation arrangements that would return them to occupied Germany within 6 weeks. The women listened in tense silence, absorbing information that should have brought relief, but instead brought only dread. Return to Germany meant facing devastation, potential starvation, and the stigma of having been captured. It meant losing the unexpected stability and purpose they had found in American captivity. Sinclair finished her prepared remarks and asked if there were questions. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Friederike stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking. "Captain Sinclair, may I speak for some of us?" Her English was clear despite her nervousness. Sinclair nodded, uncertain what was coming. Friederike looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through both prisoners and American staff. Hedwig stood next, then Thekla, then Rosemarie, then 10 others. 14 women in total, forming a distinct group within the larger assembly. Their decision had clearly been made after long deliberation. Sinclair was momentarily speechless. In all her military experience, she had never encountered prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. "I need you to clarify what you're asking," she said carefully. Friederike explained that they had tried to locate families through the Red Cross with little success. Of the 14 women standing, only 3 had received any news from Germany. 2 learned their entire families were dead. The others faced complete uncertainty about whether anyone they loved had survived. More importantly, they had found something in America that they feared losing. Here they had learned what dignity meant, had witnessed kindness where they expected cruelty, had been given chances to work and contribute and become better people than they were upon arrival. The implications were staggering. Legally, they were still enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provided for repatriation, not extended residence. But their emotional appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures. Private Henderson approached Sinclair after the assembly. "Ma'am, these women aren't our enemies anymore. They're people who got caught up in something they didn't understand. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong." That evening, Sinclair drafted an urgent report to her superiors in Washington, describing the unprecedented situation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. The women's request created immediate controversy that extended far beyond Camp Bradford. Word leaked to local newspapers, and editorials appeared questioning why Nazi prisoners should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still fighting in the Pacific. Letters to editors expressed outrage that enemy nationals might be allowed to remain in America while veterans returned home to find housing shortages and limited employment opportunities. But other voices emerged in support. Church groups that had interacted with the German women through outreach programs wrote passionate defenses of their obvious transformation and genuine remorse. The Henderson family organized a delegation of local residents to meet with camp officials, arguing that redemption should be possible in a nation founded on second chances. The debate became symbolic of larger questions about justice, forgiveness, and the meaning of American values. Inside the camp, the 14 women who had requested to stay faced intense pressure from both sides. Some of the other German prisoners accused them of betrayal, of choosing comfort over duty to their homeland. "Germany needs us now more than ever," one woman argued angrily. "Returning to help rebuild is our obligation, not our choice." The accusation stung because it contained truth. Was their desire to stay driven by principle or simply by fear of facing consequences? Father Heinrich Müller, a German-American priest from Worcester, requested permission to speak with the women in their native language. Captain Sinclair granted the request, hoping pastoral guidance might help resolve the situation. Father Müller's 3-hour conversation with the women proved to be a turning point, but not in the way anyone expected. He did not offer easy comfort or simple solutions. Instead, he asked difficult questions. "You speak of finding kindness here," he said in German, "but what about the kindness you could show others in Germany who are suffering? You talk about Germany not being your home anymore, but isn't that exactly when home needs you most? When it's broken and needs rebuilding?" His words forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their motivations. Were they being selfish by choosing the easier path? The debate intensified among the 14 women themselves. 5 began to reconsider their decision, wondering if their duty lay in returning to help rebuild their devastated homeland despite personal cost. Others felt even more convinced that they could serve better by becoming examples of transformation and reconciliation in America. The division created painful tension among women who had supported each other through months of captivity. These internal struggles were interrupted by Captain Sinclair's orders from Washington. The War Department response was characteristically bureaucratic, but unexpectedly flexible. Those who wished to return immediately could do so. However, given unusual circumstances and ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, women who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. The decision meant they would no longer be prisoners of war, but they also would no longer have guaranteed housing and support. The War Department's decision created new uncertainty more daunting than simple repatriation. The women would need sponsors, employment, and housing in communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. It was a harder path than anyone had anticipated, requiring courage that went beyond simply staying in familiar surroundings. The announcement divided the original 14 women who had requested to remain. 5 decided the uncertainty was too great and chose repatriation. They would return to Germany and face whatever they found there with courage born from their American experience. But 9 women, led by Friederike, Hedwig, Thekla, Tilda, and Rosemarie, chose to accept the challenge of starting completely new lives. The decision was terrifying because it meant stepping into unknown futures with no safety net beyond the kindness of strangers. The process of finding sponsors proved easier than expected. The Henderson family immediately formalized their offer to sponsor Friederike, providing housing and support while she sought employment as a translator. Their home had a small guest room that would become hers, and Margaret had already contacted colleagues about translation work for refugee services processing the flood of displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Lieutenant Sullivan arranged for Thekla to continue medical training at Worcester General Hospital, promising to supervise her transition from assistant to certified nurse. The hospital administrator, initially skeptical, was convinced by Sullivan's passionate advocacy and Thekla's documented competence. Other local families, moved by the women's story and obvious sincerity, stepped forward to offer support. The same communities that had initially been suspicious now embraced the opportunity to participate in what they saw as uniquely American redemption. Perhaps most significant was the decision made by several women who chose repatriation. They announced they intended to return not as defeated prisoners, but as ambassadors of the reconciliation they had experienced. They wanted to carry back lessons about forgiveness, cooperation, and the possibility of enemies becoming friends. Their choice gave moral weight to both paths, demonstrating that staying or returning could both serve larger purposes. The final repatriation day arrived on June 20th, 1945. Instead of the usual tense processing of defeated enemies, the atmosphere resembled a community farewell gathering. The 46 women choosing repatriation stood in formation, but their military bearing had softened. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at Camp Bradford, and small gifts given by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried different understanding of what America represented. Captain Sinclair's farewell address acknowledged the unprecedented nature of their situation. "You came here as our enemies, but leave as something we never expected. As friends, I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in darkest times." Friedrich responded for those remaining, her fluent English reflecting months of transformation. "We came believing we knew what America was. We learned we knew nothing." The transition from prisoners to immigrants proved challenging in ways the 9 women had not fully anticipated. Friedrich moved into the Henderson home in late June, carrying everything she owned in a single suitcase. The guest room felt simultaneously too large and too confining, after months of barracks life surrounded by other women. The silence of a private space was disorienting, leaving her alone with thoughts she had previously been able to escape through constant companionship. Margaret Henderson helped her navigate the practical requirements of American civilian life. There were documents to file, identification cards to obtain, employment applications to complete. Friedrich found work with the State Department's Refugee Services Division, using her German language skills to help process the thousands of displaced persons arriving from Europe. Her unique perspective as someone who had been on both sides of the conflict made her invaluable in bridging cultural and linguistic gaps between American officials and traumatized refugees. The irony was not lost on her. She was now helping other Germans navigate the same confusion and displacement. She had experienced offering them the same kind of patient assistance that Americans had shown her. The work gave her purpose beyond simple survival, a way to transform her experience into something constructive. She wrote in her diary that each person she helped felt like small redemption for the larger sins she could never fully atone for. Thekla thrived in her nursing training at Worcester General Hospital. Lieutenant Sullivan's mentorship continued even after Thekla's official release from military custody, the 2 women maintaining a professional relationship that evolved into genuine friendship. Thekla's careful attention to detail and natural empathy made her an excellent nurse. Within 2 years, she became head nurse of the surgical ward, her story becoming locally famous as an example of transformation and second chances. Hedwig pursued teaching certification, eventually finding work in a small elementary school where her patience and gentle manner made her beloved by students. Tilda apprenticed with a seamstress and opened her own tailoring shop. Rosemary married an American soldier she had met during her imprisonment, creating a family that embodied reconciliation between former enemies. Each woman found her own path to contribution and belonging, carrying lessons learned about the power of human kindness to overcome hatred. But perhaps most remarkable was how they maintained connections with those who had returned to Germany. Letters flowed across the Atlantic weekly, creating a network of women united by shared experience of transformation. Those in Germany wrote about the challenges of rebuilding lives in devastated cities, but also about how their American experience had given them hope and resilience to face each difficult day. The correspondence revealed that both groups were serving important purposes. Those in America demonstrated that redemption was possible through changed lives. Those in Germany carried messages about American kindness that helped convince other Germans their former enemies could be trusted partners in building better futures. Together, they formed a bridge between two countries that would need decades to fully heal from the war's devastation. May 8, 1970. Friederich Brenner Henderson stood before a gathering at the German-American Friendship Society in San Antonio. She was 50 years old now, an American citizen for 18 years, mother to two children who knew Germany only through their mother's stories. She carried with her the same small leather diary she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp Bradford, now filled with 25 years of entries documenting her journey from enemy prisoner to American citizen. Her speech that day would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most moving testimonies about the possibility of peace between former enemies. She spoke about the morning Captain Sinclair announced their freedom to return to Germany and how that announcement had forced them to confront the most important question of their lives. What did home truly mean when everything familiar had been destroyed? "We discovered," she told the audience, "that home is not just where you come from, it is where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst. We found that forgiveness is not something given to you, it is something you earn through your actions and your commitment to being better than you were before." The words carried weight because they were backed by decades of lived experience, not just philosophical ideals. The story of the German women who chose to stay had become more than historical curiosity. It had become a symbol of America's capacity for redemption and renewal, proof that even in darkest times, people could choose to see past hatred to recognize humanity in their enemies. Their success influenced American policies toward refugees and immigrants for decades, demonstrating that the nation's greatest strength lay not in military might, but in its capacity to offer second chances to those willing to embrace American values. Thekla, now Dr. Thekla Schmidt, had returned to Germany in 1965 as part of a medical exchange program. She found a country transformed, rebuilt not just in its cities and infrastructure, but in its values and commitment to human rights. She often said her experience in American captivity had prepared her to appreciate how completely Germany had changed because she had experienced her own complete transformation firsthand. The women who had originally chosen repatriation in 1945 had played their own crucial role in Germany's reconstruction. They carried stories of American kindness that helped convince other Germans their former enemies could be trusted partners in building better futures. Several became leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between the two countries and ensure that the lessons of war were not forgotten. As Friederich concluded her speech, she held up the small leather diary that had accompanied her entire journey. "In this diary, I wrote the questions every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become? The remarkable thing about America is that it gave me the freedom to discover I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given." The legacy of Buttermilk Biscuits on a Wednesday morning had changed everything.